Let's start with a horrific fatal shooting at a Dallas ICE facility. The FBI is investigating the matter as a targeted attack against ICE. And Kash Patel has posted an image of the bullet on X with anti-ICE written on one of the shell casings. Yet MSNBC insists that there's no evidence that this is left-wing extremism.
You can't just assume by that what was written on that shell casing that that's necessarily his motivation. He could have been doing that to thinking it was funny, trying to put law enforcement on the wrong track. This is where, when you analyze the person's phone, computer, talk to his family and friends, that you get an idea of what his motivation perhaps really was.
And Emily, there's a lot of attention on Gavin Newsom at the moment because just hours before this shooting, Gavin Newsom joined The Late Show to claim that ICE officers arresting illegals, that they were authoritarian actions by an authoritarian government. Listen to what he had to say.
People ask, well, is authoritarianism, you're being hyperbolic? Bull, we're being hyperbolic. If you're a black and brown community, it's here in this country. And so I'm deeply proud that I had the privilege of signing the nation's first bill to address the issue of masking. Also to require, you have simple identification, to your point. I mean, if some guy jumped out of an unmarked car in a van with a mask on, tried to grab me, I mean, by definition, you're going to push back.
Now, Donald Trump has blasted, quote, radical left Democrats for fueling anti-law enforcement violence following this fatal shooting in Dallas. And he says he's planning on signing an executive order against left-wing domestic terrorism. He says that I've been briefed on the deadly shooting at the ICE field office in Dallas, Texas. It's now been revealed that the deranged shooter wrote anti-ICE on his shell casings. This is despicable. The brave men and women of ICE are just trying to do their jobs and remove the worst of the worst criminals out of our country, but they are facing an unprecedented increase in threats, violence and attacks by deranged radical leftists. Now, this violence is the result of the radical left Democrats constantly demonising law enforcement, calling for ICE to be demolished and comparing ICE officers to Nazis. The continuing violence from radical left terrorists in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination must be stopped. ICE officers and other brave members of law enforcement are under grave threat. Emily, I want to get your thoughts on all of this, but I suspect that Donald Trump has a lot of support.
Oh, absolutely. This will, especially after a tragic example like what happened in Dallas. And, to the point made on MSNBC, of course, it's possible right now when the shooter killed himself that we'll learn more in the days to come. But the preponderance of the evidence points in one direction here. It's clearly written anti-ICE on the casings. Maybe that turns out to be some type of weird joke, but you have a casing that says anti-ICE and you have somebody shooting at an ICE detention facility in this climate where there have been a lot of threats made against ICE. There was the news outlet, conservative news outlet here in the US called Town Hall, put together a supercut of all of the times ICE has been compared to the Gestapo on MSNBC recently, which fuels the point that Republicans have been making over the last 2 weeks, that the more people try to, on the left, Nazify or paint the right not merely as peaceful opponents engaged in political differences, but people who are dangerous and violent threats, like the Gestapo, for example, the more you get a climate where people are inclined to take matters into their own hands.
And Emily, this week, Trump designated Antifa as a terrorist organisation. He also wrote on Truth Social, "We've already declared Antifa a terrorist organisation, and I'll be signing an executive order this week to dismantle these domestic terrorism networks. I'm calling on all Democrats to stop this rhetoric against ICE and America's law enforcement right now. The Trump administration is fully committed to backing law enforcement, strong borders, securing our homeland, deporting violent illegal criminals, and fully rooting out the left-wing domestic terrorism that is terrorising our country. Thank you for your attention to this matter." Now, Emily, left-wing terrorism is a very real threat. We're, of course, seeing mainstream media outlets refusing to call it what it is. But can you talk to us about what this means now Antifa has been declared a terrorist organisation? The White House now has the authority to subpoena bank accounts, look at wire transfers, foreign and domestic sources of funding. Is that right?
Yeah, I talked to Andy No recently, who's one of the experts on Antifa as a journalist, and he was explaining that from his perspective, it looks like RICO cases, so the types of cases that have been brought actually against Donald Trump, but also traditionally against like the mafia. You may be able to apply those to some of these left-wing groups now, like Antifa. This is actually a fairly new tactic that Donald Trump is rolling out, declaring a domestic organization that is, of course, diffuse and intentionally hard to track down as a terrorist organization. So does it allow prosecutors then to bring together Antifa chapters that have cooperated around the country? Or Antifa chapters that have cooperated in the steps towards violence or the steps towards paramilitary type activity in Portland, for example, or in Southern California. Does this allow prosecutors? The argument here from the Trump administration is that it makes it easier to prosecute some of those cases that have otherwise been slippery and difficult to nail down for legal reasons.
Emily, I want to talk to you about this story that I think has also been completely overlooked, that Google has admitted to censoring political speech after pressure from the Biden administration. Now, Google has pledged to reinstate thousands of banned YouTube accounts, and in a letter to the House Judiciary Committee, Google admitted that the Biden administration had pressured it to remove content despite that content not having violated YouTube's policies. So Google will now be allowing creators that were banned for political speech on topics such as COVID-19, the election, and other issues to return to the platform. And looking at this story, I wasn't really surprising. I mean, we've heard Mark Zuckerberg admit that the Biden administration made Facebook remove posts as well, including posts that were true at the time. So wasn't really a surprise. What were your thoughts?
No, I agree with you completely that it seems to have been overlooked. I mean, these are busy news cycles here in the US, but this is a very important story. And as somebody who worked at a conservative news outlet when all of this was happening at the Federalist, I agree with my former boss, Sean Davis, over there, who was saying this cost millions. And Google is now, just because there's a Republican president in power, coming out and saying, hey, it was a mistake. The former administration pressured us, acting like they were sort of between a rock and a hard place, which of course they were. I mean, being pressured by the government is no small matter. At the same time, they do ostensibly have agency as a private company to stand up for what's right and to not go out of their way, as happened in several cases, take matters into their own hands as a company, even without pressure from the government, and start to suppress conservative websites and conservative content. So I'm curious actually how long this lasts, if this is another corporation that's kind of trying to make nice with Republicans now that Donald Trump is in power and he is wielding his power. So it's sort of too little too late, and I'm curious to see how long this actually lasts into the future, honestly.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Absolutely too little too late. President Trump blasted the UN at the General Assembly yesterday. He said, "What is the purpose of the United Nations?" And he said, "I've always said the UN has such tremendous, tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential." He went on to blast the climate alarmism and out of control migration. Now, Emily, it's interesting. Back in 2017, UN delegates laughed at Donald Trump and his remarks, but they weren't laughing at him this time.
And, the times where Trump was intentionally funny, it was sort of interesting. For example, the teleprompter stopped in the middle of his speech. There was more laughter with him this time, because I think people have come to recognize that when Donald Trump, whose country is still the top funder of the United Nations, comes in and says he has a problem with the United Nations, it's not a joke. It wasn't a joke with NATO, for example. Donald Trump actually induced structural changes to the way NATO operates. And I think what we're seeing this time around, whether it's respect or fear, it is a new attitude towards Donald Trump, which gives him then this sense of being able to come in there and say, what's the purpose of the UN? As he is also pitching himself for a Nobel Peace Prize and saying, I've stopped all of these conflicts around the world. It was a really interesting speech where he was trying to do those two things at once: swing for the fences and say, I'm the peace president, and then at the same time actually offering these structural, fundamental criticisms of the United Nations. So it's a very Trumpian combination of goals.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that what happened with the teleprompter. It was interesting. There was a teleprompter incident, and then, of course, there was the incident where the escalators appeared to have stopped. Let's just take a look. Now, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt is calling for an investigation about this. And Donald Trump wrote on Truth Social today, a real disgrace took place at the UN yesterday. Not one, not two, but three very sinister events. First, the escalator going up to the main speaking floor came to a screeching halt. It stopped on a dime. It's amazing that Melania and I didn't fall forward onto the sharp edges of these steel steps face first. He went on to say that this is absolutely sabotage, and also referenced that earlier post that was in the London Times that said that UN workers were joking about turning off an escalator. Trump also noted that he also claimed that people should be arrested over this. And then he talked about, of course, what happened with the teleprompter incident. And I think Donald Trump handled that brilliantly, where he can just talk off script, unlike Joe Biden. But he mentioned the teleprompter incident, that didn't work. And then the third point he makes, after making his speech, he was told that the sound was completely turned off, and even Melania couldn't hear him. So in his post, he wrote that this was useless, and that you couldn't hear a thing. And he claims that it wasn't a coincidence. This was triple sabotage at the UN. They ought to be ashamed of themselves. Emily, what do you make of what happened? Was it sabotage, or is it pretty, I suppose, bizarre that three things clearly went wrong for Donald Trump?
Well, unfortunately for the UN, which is claiming through a spokeswoman that it was actually Donald Trump and Melania Trump's camera person who had been backing up the escalator to get the shot of them that caused it to stop working. Unfortunately for that case from the UN, there was that leak to the Times that said it was a prank. People were considering pulling, stopping the escalator. So to have such a specific leak about something like that perhaps happening, seeing it happen, I think suggests actually the UN should be taking this seriously. There are a lot of people in the Trump world who are irate, particularly about the escalator, because they said in this climate, Donald Trump has already had a bullet into his ear. And this is a time of heightened tensions about potential political violence. Could that have been a moment that was orchestrated to harm the Trumps in some way or another? It is a serious question. It seems like a little thing, but when you have a president of the United States involved, it's serious. And of course, Trump has threatened funding to the UN, from the US for, and all of that. So it seems entirely possible that UN staffers were just not on their best behavior in protest of US funding threats, even though, again, if you're the president of the United States and you have been the top funder of the United Nations for years, your country has been, you don't expect that even when you have some critiques of the UN, you get retaliated against on American soil, by the way.
Yeah, and it's good, you mentioned there that the UN spokesperson said that a videographer from the US delegation triggered the stop mechanism at the top of the escalator. That is what the UN is saying. But yeah, interesting to see, for the world to see, I suppose, all caught on camera. But let's talk about James Comey. The Justice Department is seeking to indict former FBI Director James Comey for perjury, as the deadline to bring charges is coming up. Now, this is the probe into Comey, which centres around whether he lied to Congress during his September 30, 2020 testimony about his handling of the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential elections. Emily, I suppose we were expecting this.
Yes, absolutely. It was, I think, in July where Tulsi Gabbard stepped out at the White House, the podium at the White House briefing room, and started talking about how there was this plot against Donald Trump that was being referred to the Department of Justice. And I actually asked her that day, does that include former President Barack Obama? And she said, potentially, yes. So this is the first. If this happens, this is sort of just the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, a really important name for Trump to, from his perspective, get an indictment against because of how bitterly Comey fought Donald Trump behind the scenes and then ultimately in front of cameras. But the deadline here is September 30th, because that's when the Trump administration believes Comey committed perjury 5 years ago. So there's a 5-year statute of limitations that expires on the 30th. And that means we can pretty clearly expect perjury charges related to the congressional testimony he gave on the 30th of September in 2020. It's not the easiest case in the world for the Trump administration. Perjury is sort of notoriously difficult. You have to prove that someone said something they knew to be false, which is sort of getting into their minds and all of that. But there's just really no question that James Comey was routinely misleading, both as FBI director and after he was FBI director, about the targeting of Donald Trump from the FBI.
Absolutely. Now, finally, the White House has unveiled a presidential walk of fame outside the West Wing, and it, of course, shows portraits of presidents, and the portrait of former President Joe Biden has been replaced, Emily. Let's see if we've got the images for you, but it has been replaced with the autopen. I think that is Donald Trump sending a pretty big message. There it is. There's Joe Biden's autopen. Look, it makes me laugh, even though I suppose it is serious.
Yeah, it is serious, of course, because they are potentially looking into whether some of those pardons are can be legally challenged. And we're talking like bulk pardons, and in some cases, high-profile people like potentially Anthony Fauci, members of the Biden family. So definitely ominous, but a very, I mean, not surprising from Trump, but still one of those incredibly unusual Trump behaviors that is still here in Washington a shock to the system to see literally on the walls of the White House a gold framed Joe Biden autopen picture. It still is, I must admit, a shock to the system 10 years into Trump's political career.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. Emily Jashinsky, host of After Party with Emily Jashinsky on MK Media. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.